Zelensky had an interview with the German Bild. He says that they're planning to attack Kerch Bridge in Crimea. At the same time, we heard that NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg was talking about that Ukraine can attack Russia outside the special military operations zone. When you see these signs coming from the West, coming from Ukrainians, do you think we are heading toward new escalations, or we are heading toward the end of this conflict in Ukraine?
I think neither. I think that they have to somehow stay in the news, and so they produce various kinds of little narratives or spin-offs of narratives or recirculations of old narratives that have played to some extent. They can't really come up with anything new. They're fixated on that bridge, and so they're trying to come up with new ways to attack it. I don't know whether that's going to work. In terms of the terrorist attacks on Russian territory, well, the Ukraine is being paid off in spades for that in terms of destroyed power generation facilities. The Ukraine is basically heading into a period of time where most of it will have no electricity. And come next winter will no longer be habitable. So the Russians are giving the Ukraine plenty of warning, the Ukrainians, that is, that basically what they have to do is get out. So Kherson, for instance, will not be habitable. Kiev will not be habitable, etc. They've recently destroyed a very large power plant in the Kiev region, which supplied most of the electricity to the Kiev region during ever since the Chernobyl disaster. But it is now gone. It is now demolished. And curiously, the Lithuanians are dismantling an unused power plant of theirs, since Lithuania's population has dwindled. It no longer has any industry to speak of. It no longer has the same power requirements. So they have an unused power plant left over from the Soviet days. They're dismantling it and shipping the parts to the Ukraine in the hopes that the Ukrainians will be able to restore their power generation facilities. Of course, that is silly, because as soon as that power plant, if it ever goes back online, the Russians will just toss another rocket at it and it'll be offline again, this time forever. So this entire ploy of attacking Russian power generation facilities and petrochemical plants is misfiring in a grand fashion as far as the Ukrainians are concerned.
We know that during this conflict, the western part of Ukraine didn't feel this war. Is it going to be changed in the western part of Ukraine? Is Russia going to show them that it's not going to be that simple if they continue this conflict, this war? Or they're going to let them the way they have been living during this conflict and not feeling what's going on in Ukraine, in the eastern part of Ukraine?
Well, I don't think Russia is going to start attacking civilians. It'll depower the place. It's doing that. It'll destroy every last bit of defense-related industry that the Ukraine has left. It's successfully demolishing any facilities that are being used to manufacture explosives or artillery shells or drones, or boats. And that is going quite well. At the same time, Russia is going to continue pushing on the front line, basically continuing to free up the still occupied parts of Russian Federation territory, new Russian Federation territory. So Lugansk is pretty much free. Donetsk still has a chunk of it to go. Kherson and Zaporozhye have big pieces that have to be liberated. And so Russia will continue pushing on that, but that is strictly military action. It does not affect civilians. It will continue resisting getting civilians involved in military action, since those would be war crimes, and the Russians aren't interested in any of that. That would be a Ukrainian thing. Now, as far as people not feeling that there is a war, well, I think that there's going to be some basically some destitution, because until very recently and until the present, the Ukrainian population has been getting social payments care of the West. The West has been giving the Kiev government lots and lots of money, billions of dollars of money. And the Kiev government has been using that money to pay pensioners and school teachers and policemen and municipal workers, what have you. Now, that is coming to an end. That money is drying up. Congress is no longer approving new spending. The Europeans don't really have that much money. And maintaining this gigantic pauper state is not something anybody can perpetually engage in. So, so people in the Ukraine will start to feel destitution creeping in. Add to that the fact that there won't be electricity or running water, and that the roads haven't been maintained in years, so that major arteries may still be passable, but all of the country roads are in absolutely impassable condition. All of those things will slowly add up to a feeling of absolute desperation as far as the civilian population is concerned. And that is registering pretty well. I think that, it's a totalitarian regime, and people are afraid to speak their minds, and they have to toe the line and act Ukrainian. But there's more and more of a resistance movement. A number of Ukrainian generals have gone over to the Russian side, and all of the intelligence that the Russians are collecting, a lot of it comes from the officer staff of the Ukrainian army. And also there are lots of people on the ground who are providing Russians with information about Ukrainian troop movements, about the locations of Ukrainian armor, about their munitions depots, and more and more about their battle plans, so that the Russians know exactly what the Ukrainians are going to do, even sometimes before the Ukrainians themselves know what they're going to do. So really, it's coming apart at the seams at that basic level. And a great number of people in the Ukraine, not so much perhaps in the West, but definitely the rest of it, are just really waiting for the Russian tank columns to roll in. They'll meet them with open arms, and be very happy that they can now stop speaking Ukrainian, stop acting Ukrainian, and just go back to being what they've always been, which is Southern Russian.
Do we know if the Ukrainian government considered some sort of privilege for the western part of Ukraine, and they didn't send them to the battlefield?
I don't think that there are any crisp distinctions anymore, but I think that there's a basic bigotry on the part of Western Ukrainians, who have been since the coup, have been a very important element of the Kiev regime and of the military. All of the Nazi battalions have been basically packed with Western Ukrainian neo-Nazis. A lot of them are dead now, but their influence is still felt. So they really hate the Russians. And so when they have to pick people to go and die on the battlefield, they're more likely to pick the Russians for that job than their own number. And the Ukraine is basically not very homogenous at all, but it is more and more Russian the further east you go. So that people in the east speak absolutely perfect literary Russian, whereas people further west speak a sort of dialect called Surzhyk, which is basically Russian with a Ukrainian accent and some Ukrainian words. And then when you get as far as actual Western Ukraine, Ivano-Frankovsk and Lvov, there you actually find people who sort of speak an older Ukrainian dialect that could be called maybe a proper Ukrainian language, although it's still just a Southern Russian dialect. So there are these gradations of ethnicity, you might say, although it's not really ethnicity. It's just basically some kind of an imposed identity. And there are also gradations of ethnic hatred that go with it, that correspond to their willingness to send people to their death.
You've mentioned this terrorist attack in Russia. The public opinion or the official opinion of the Putin administration, they're thinking of that this attack was done by Ukrainians or was done by the Western countries through Ukraine.
Well, there's an ongoing investigation. It is basically understood that the people who are actual perpetrators and some of the people who provided them with weapons and intelligence and sold them a car and gave them a place to live and etc. Were not really the powers behind it. There's evidence, hard evidence, that the Ukrainian regime was behind it, that the Kiev regime was behind it. And what Russia is doing now is collecting evidence that behind that regime was basically British and American functionaries, including perhaps Victoria Nuland herself. And the Russians are now approaching it from the point of view of those who helped perpetuate this act of terrorism are terrorists, no matter what their position is. So, for instance, Hunter Biden, who still has a hand in Burisma, is guilty if it is proven that Burisma gave money to finance this act of terrorism. So Hunter Biden will basically be facing life in prison in a Russian jail, and how he will be brought to Russia to serve out a sentence is a very good question. But if it involves violating American territorial sovereignty, so be it. That is really beginning to gel in the minds of Russian officials.
We know right after this attack, the officials in Washington were talking about ISIS-K, they did this. But it seems that the Russian officials are not considering this as an attack coming from ISIS-K. Is that the case?
The idea that this is ISIS-K is ridiculous. First of all, ISIS-K pulled out of Afghanistan together with American troops because it's an American creation. As Donald Trump said, ISIS was created by Barack Obama. I'm quoting Donald Trump pretty much. And I don't think he made it up. I think that's really the case. Just like Al-Qaeda was an American creation, ISIS is an American creation. ISIS was created to destroy Syria. And it went pretty far in that direction until the Russians got involved. And what they did was they pretty much killed all of these ISIS people. And the few stragglers, the few survivors, were evacuated by the Americans to northern Afghanistan, where they somehow persisted with American help until Americans fled Afghanistan, at which point they fled together with them. And guess where they fled to? To the Ukraine, where they surfaced, some of them. So this is all just Americans, and saying it's not the Ukrainians who have the Americans behind them. It is ISIS-K which has the Americans behind them. Well, that's pretty silly, because how many different ways are there for Americans to point fingers at themselves? So this is really illustrative of the absolutely dismal state of American mentality, you might say, their ability to reason through problems, where they're trying to deflect blame from the Ukraine, which they helped organize this terrorist attack, by shifting the blame to an organization which is known as a front for the American special services. How sillier does it get? And then to top it off, there's Victoria Nuland standing by herself in front of some kind of a picnic table in the middle of a deserted Kiev street, saying that there's going to be a very nasty surprise for Putin right before the election. And then there's footage of one of the terrorists walking around the venue where the terrorist strike took place on the eve of the election, as a result of which it was probably decided that the security is too tight and we have to postpone it. And then they probably tried to cancel the event because holding the event after the election made no sense, but failed to do so. So basically, they lost control of the operation. That sort of thing happens a lot when you hire hitmen. A lot of the time, to call off the hitmen costs you more than to hire them. And maybe Victoria Nuland just didn't have enough money in her pockets to do that at that point. So the whole thing is first of all, it's preposterous, and secondly, it's just downright stupid. It just shows the degenerate state of all of these American officials.
During this conflict, there are a lot of people in the West, in Russia, they were criticizing Putin for his strategy, for his attitude toward this conflict. We had Prigozhin, who was criticizing Putin and his administration for not being too aggressive in the conflict. He wanted something more aggressive in the conflict. But when we see right now what's going on in Moldova, in Lithuania, these kind of sending troops, German troops to Lithuania, we totally understand what was the strategy on the part of Putin. He was totally considering everything, every movement that would come from NATO. And his priority during this conflict was less casualties on the part of Russians. That was so, he could manage that amazingly, in my view.
Well, first of all, let's just get rid of the whole NATO troops on this or that soil. It's interesting that you bring up Prigozhin, because he single-handedly, with his merry band of mercenaries, tossed the French out of several African countries in a row. So that's what NATO is really worth. All you have to do is hire one cutthroat who can then hire some more thugs, and they can basically do whatever they want to NATO, and NATO will run away. So the French couldn't do anything. They couldn't field 3,000 troops if they tried, who would actually fight, who wouldn't run away. And same with all of these, German troops rattling around the place. It's just hilarious to watch. All of these pictures surfacing all over the place. My wife and I were just laughing at a picture of a captain, a U.S. Navy captain, who was posing with a submachine gun with the optical sight mounted backwards and pointing into his eye, and the butt of the machine gun resting on his shoulder and his finger on the trigger. So here's a ship's captain, United States Navy, getting ready to poke his own eye out. That's what happens when you do that with a weapon. And this was a publicity photo, and then they realized, oh my God, this looks so stupid, and they pulled the photo, but the internet remembers everything. So basically, what these NATO troops massing next to Russia's borders are perhaps sacrificial lambs, but probably just people on a field trip. a nice field trip. They'll rattle around the countryside. They'll play with guns. They'll blow some things up. A few of them will die because they're not really sufficiently safety conscious or something. And then they'll go home, and to their girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever, and that'll be it. Um, it's nothing. It's really just nothing. But there are far more serious dimensions to this conflict. One of them is that the confrontation between Russia and the Ukraine is more along the lines of a civil war. So it's taking a really long time for the Ukrainians to convince themselves, because the Russians aren't going to do it for them, that they really don't want to be Ukrainians anymore. It's very slowly sinking in all over the place in the Ukraine that being Ukrainian, to put it as mildly and politely as I can, absolutely sucks. Nobody in their right mind would ever want to be a Ukrainian, speak that language, go to those schools, share in that absolutely ridiculous ideology of this rabid anti-Russian nationalism. Everybody should just abandon it. It's a useless thing. It just needs to be left alone to die. And so it's taking the Ukrainians a really long time to come around to that realization. At the same time, if people want to go and try to kill Russians, then the Russians have no choice but to kill them. And that is happening at the front. So you read these reports of 1,000 Ukrainians there and 2,000 Ukrainians there getting killed, along with lots of mercenaries and official NATO troops. Why not? So lots of people are getting killed, and that's really unfortunate. But it's a war, it's a military engagement. It's not a cakewalk or anything like that. But as far as NATO is concerned, that's just basically nonsense. The actual action involves the Russians and the former Ukrainians who are taking their time being convinced that they're not really Ukrainian at all.
You talk about the situation of France in Africa. We know that recently the president of Senegal was talking about France should consider going out of his country. They don't want France to be in their country. At the same time, we see a strange behavior on the part of Macron. How much of this strange behavior, this animosity that is new, we didn't have it before this conflict in Africa? I personally didn't see this type of animosity that Macron is presenting right now toward Russia before having these difficulties in Africa.
Well, Macron is a truly ridiculous character at this point. The whole fiasco in the Sahel in Africa, where now there's basically a band of pro-Russian, anti-French countries, basically going from the Indian Ocean all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, where Senegal was the last piece, the last jigsaw puzzle piece to drop into place. That is the Atlantic beachfront to complete the whole scenario. So that is just too embarrassing for him. He can't talk about Africa anymore because it's just such a fiasco. He can't really talk about lots of important subjects, such as the fact that France has been cut off from its uranium imports, and its nuclear power industry is going to be in dire straits before too long. There's a lot of pipeline inertia in the nuclear industry, but still, this is a very, very, very bad thing for France. He can't talk about that. He can't really make an impression on the Europeans. So basically, when he said that, well, we're not discounting our ability to introduce official French troops into Odessa. Well, that looked so ridiculous that everybody just basically tried to not pay attention, but basically said, no, we're not going along with this plan. Everybody said that. So he basically stands by himself. And then if you look at the fact that France did introduce some troops into Odessa back after the Russian Revolution, where they stole some grain and then pulled out, and that was it. It was a shameful event. They want a repeat of that shameful event. Why? It doesn't really make any sense. I think that this has to do with Macron's mental difficulties. It doesn't really have to do with any sort of thought out, systematic attempt to formulate foreign policy. I think this is just Macron. You know, he has huge problems now. He has economic problems in France. Lots of people are opposed to him. He's lost French Africa. The Olympic Games are turning into some kind of a ridiculous non-event. And, you know, things are not going his way. And he's sufficiently immature and sufficiently narcissistic to try to get out of that situation by having some kind of a psychotic break with reality and imagining that he's Napoleon. I think that's what's really going on. I don't think that looking at it as, you know, putting on your foreign policy analyst hat and trying to go at it that way doesn't really make sense.
There is an argument in the United States, in Israel, that the Netanyahu administration wants to attack Rafah. This is the last piece of land that there are huge amount of people in that region, in Rafah. And the situation is dire, starvation, there are many problems there. And it seems that Netanyahu and his administration are feeling that this would be their last chance of, I don't know what's in their mind, but of winning this conflict, this war, or whatever they want to do. At the same time, we see that the Biden administration that has been hurting too much on their policy because of their policy in Gaza. And the Arab states, the King of Jordan was recently talking with Biden. He sent a message to Biden from the Arab states that attack on Rafah would be very consequential for Israel. And how do you see the situation right now in Israel, in Rafah?
Well, I think Israel is self-destructing politically, first of all. Secondly, economically, the fact that the Red Sea is pretty much closed to Israel-bound navigation means that Israel now has very few lifelines left. Curiously, one of the largest ones is from Turkey, but Turkey's playing this game where they could just basically shut it down any moment they want. They have the absolute leverage on Israel at this point. I think that there's an insane element to Israeli politics. There's this Netanyahu character who is now a world-renowned war criminal, who is allied with some really ridiculously bigoted people. His coalition is just really, really nasty Zionist nationalists, and that is basically all he has you know, as his power base. On the other hand, most of the Israeli population is convinced that they could somehow get rid of all Palestinians. That's their wonderful wish, is why don't we make all of the Palestinians go away? Not realizing that, you know, that cuts both ways. If all Palestinians go away, then nobody knows what will happen next. But it's quite possible that all the Jews will go away too. It's funny how that works. You know, if you start an absolute war where you kill off an entire population, well, you know, that comes around. And now that they've bombed the Iranian embassy in Syria, which is an unspeakable act. Now they're all sitting, basically waiting to be hit. And everybody's saying, well, well, there are two different types of analysis. One is that basically that Iran has enough rockets to pretty much just destroy Israel. And then some people saying, oh, but maybe Israel has some very old nuclear weapons that might even have some rockets that would be used to deliver them, and some might make it through, and there might be an actual nuclear explosion in Iran. When Iran is a pretty big country, so one nuclear bomb won't destroy it. Not even 3 nuclear bombs will destroy it. But it will definitely be the end of Israel if that happens, no matter what happens. Another line of reasoning is that why should Iran do that when it has invested so much effort in the Shia crescent, which is not really even Shia, it's also Sunni, it's also communist, it's also God knows what. Why can't they just use the Houthis and send them some appropriate rockets to keep shooting at Israel? And Yemen is anti-fragile. They could use the Hezbollah in Lebanon, but Lebanon is fragile. Whereas the Houthis and Yemen are anti-fragile. The more you try to hurt them, the more they hurt you, and that's basically the only rule that there is when it comes to those people. It's like fighting wasps with a chopstick. It's like it just doesn't work. So I expect all kinds of strange cryptic things to work, but I don't expect this situation to de-escalate anytime soon, because Iran has the ability to use, not to escalate out of control, but to use the tension itself to its advantage. And it'll milk that advantage for all it's worth. That's what I expect.
Turkey, recently Erdogan is putting some sort of sanctions on Israel, and they're not sending 54 products to Israel. And at the same time, you see the population in Israel who are 78% against the Netanyahu administration. At the same time, 68% of these people totally in favor of their policy in Gaza. It's unbelievable. When you look at the Israeli population, in your opinion, do they really understand what's going on and how desperately they would need Turkey and these countries to survive in that region?
Well, I think that Erdogan is not doing anything drastic when it comes to Israel because he's making so much money. Turks are all about money. They're very shrewd when it comes to money, and they're not really big moralizers. So yes, they'll put some just for window dressing. They'll put some silly sanctions on Israel, but they'll continue shipping oil to Israel, and that's the big thing. Whether he'll be able to politically continue doing that, who knows? He's a very slippery character. But the big thing is that when Israel attacked the embassy in Syria, the Iranian embassy in Syria, the American reaction is what told me that things are not what they used to be, because what the Americans immediately called Tehran, and basically what they said was, please don't hurt us. You can do whatever you want to Israel, but please do not hurt us. Isn't that pathetic? Don't lob any more missiles at our defenseless army bases because all we have is these Patriots, and we gave them all to the Ukrainians, and the Russians destroyed them, so we're defenseless now. That's basically the American posture now, is like, you can do whatever you want with our main ally in the Middle East, just don't hurt us, because we can't do anything. We can't even pull those bases out of there because we don't have the money for it. All we can do is sit there and take it. So please don't hurt us. That is really a big change. So Israel, as everybody knows, the only reason Israel still exists is because it has American support. And now it no longer has American support, and yet it still exists. And the question is, for how much longer? That's the only question left. How much longer will it take for Israel to basically boil away into space?
Recently, Lavrov was talking with Minister of Foreign Affairs of China, and we know that this cooperation, this partnership is getting to the next level, and every time it's getting to the higher level. And at the same time, we've seen that the United States, when they group up U.S. Marine to Taiwan, in this case, we have some sort of escalation in the relationship between the United States and China. It seems that the outcome of these two conflicts, the conflict that is in Taiwan right now, it's mostly political conflict, and the conflict that is a hot war in Ukraine. How do you see the role of these two conflicts in bringing Russia and China even closer and having much more security contracts, I don't know, military contracts, technological contracts?
Well, what happened in terms of shifts, in terms of the Russia-China relationship, there's really no news to report. It's just going very well. Trade is continuing to expand. They've de-dollarized their trade completely. All of that is happening, and the big problems there are bottlenecks having to do with Russian rail, which Russia is widening as fast as they can. Lots of construction going on the Trans-Siberian. But the shift that happened in China-U.S. relationship is that Yellen went to China and tried to berate and nag China into not helping Russia. And the Chinese basically said, if we feel like helping Russia, we're going to help Russia. And who the hell are you? And she was fed some dinner and sent back. That was pretty much it. So basically what that shows is that US leverage on China is decreasing in terms of political leverage. Now, in terms of military leverage, well, what can they do? They can run around Taiwan. They can run around Taiwan all they want. Are they going to attack China? No. Is China going to attack Taiwan? No. China wants Taiwan to basically have a referendum to join the mainland. They don't want that to be the outcome of a military action. So the conditions are not conducive to that at this point, but China is very patient and can wait, can afford to wait. Nothing is really going badly for China right now. Nothing is terribly wrong. So there's no reason to rush things. On the other hand, things couldn't be going worse for the United States. So there's every reason for the United States to rush things. But what can the United States do? Beg Iran not to hurt them. What else? Beg the Chinese not to help Russia. Well, that was useless. That didn't work. So what can Americans do? Nothing, absolutely nothing.